All right, so I'm assuming I'm all good to go here. So yeah, my name is Brandon Kumagai, and I just want to thank Alyssa to start off so much for having me here today. So the last few presentations have been absolutely amazing, and I hope I can follow it up here. So my presentation is going to be on what I call a point trend value. So that is a metric that I've created to measure a player's rate of improvement over a season through their cumulative point production. And before I get to that, just a little bit about me. So I just graduated a couple of weeks ago from McMaster University with a degree in math and stats. And I'm going to be doing research at Mac this summer as a data analyst for the visual neuroscience lab there. And in my spare time, I like to coach hockey. So this year I've been helping out at the MLSE Launchpad as a ball hockey instructor. And I've been the assistant coach of the West Hill Golden Hawks, the same minor hockey team I grew up playing for. And yeah, without further ado, I'll jump right into my presentation here. So I'll start off with a quote here from a scouting article from a guy named Mike Guess. This is just to provide motivation for what I'm going to be talking about here today. So he says, looking at this season's stats alone does not allow one to make many projections for the future. One has to compare not only to past seasons, but over the current season. Players who start off hot but fade down the stretch, in particular in the playoffs, likely had some early success due to some surprise element and the fact that more borderline players will play on opposition teams in the early going. If they are unable to increase their performance as they should have become more used to the team and league, if they didn't pick up the pace when the chips were down, it doesn't augur well for an NHL future. And so what I want to do in this presentation is kind of put this theory to the test by determining a way to measure a player's rate of improvement, which I'll do with the point trend value metric. Then I want to see if point trend values have any influence on future success to determine if this theory is actually true or not. And I also want to look to see if point trend values have any influence on how NHL teams draft, just to see if NHL scouts actually believe this theory or not. And I'm going to kick it off with an example here. So I have three players, Michael Scarboza, Ryan Spooner, and Sean Monahan. And I'm going to be looking at their OHL seasons either in 2010-11 or 2011-12. And if you look at their point totals and games played in those years, you can see that they're all nearly identical and they're all within 0.05 points per game of each other. But if we look underneath the hood here, we can see that they took three very different paths to get there. So in this plot here, the black dots represent each player's cumulative points over the year. And the colored lines represent a quadratic regression model fit to each player's data. So that's basically using a mathematical model to kind of create a curve that kind of best describes their cumulative points. And as we can see here, Sean Monahan in the red line started out very hot, but faded down the stretch. Ryan Spooner stayed pretty steady all year long. And Michael Scarboza started out pretty cold, but then picked it up and finished off strong, with all three of them ending up at around the same place. And if we look beyond that season, we can see that Michael Scarboza continued to stay hot into the playoffs and the following regular season, with great numbers in both of those cases. But in the long term, Sean Monahan ended up being the best of the three as he became the NHL star of this group. So the purpose of this example is really just to give a visual representation about what I'm going to be talking about. So what I want to do here is kind of do this kind of analysis for thousands of players. And how I'll do that is in this plot here, I want to break this down into one number per player to describe how their cumulative points change throughout the year. And to do that, the first thing I have to do is to collect a ton of data. So I'm going to be looking at OHL and WHL forwards between 2010-11 and 2018-19 with at least 40 games played and 30 points. And altogether, after scraping the data from the OHL and WHL websites, I end up with 2,489 seasons of game log data. And once I have that, I can now calculate the point trend value. So like I mentioned before, point trend value is a measure of a player's rate of improvement over a season by quantifying the curvature in his or her cumulative points. So I'm going to do this in 3 different steps here. If you're not a big math person, you could just tune me out for a minute. I might get a bit mathy here, but after that, everything should be pretty easy to understand. So the first step is to create the curve. So what we want to do here is fit a quadratic regression model to each player's cumulative point production over a season. And that's the exact same thing as those colored lines that we saw in the previous example with Monahan. And how we do that is we use R to calculate values of beta 0, beta 1, beta 2 in this quadratic regression equation here that best fit each player's cumulative points. And from that, we can take the second derivative of this equation and determine how the concavity of the curve, or how much it curves and which direction it curves. And that's given by this equation here, 2 beta 2. Then we multiply that by 500. Then that gives us our point trend value. We do this step mainly because it's a lot easier to interpret numbers like 4 than it would be to interpret a number like 0.008. And basically what we end up getting here is a measurement of a player's rate of improvement in their cumulative points over the season. So if this point trend value, so the point trend value kind of ranges from positive 20 to negative 20. The higher it is, the more curvature there'll be in an upward direction, kind of like what we see with Braden Point here. The closer it is to the lower end, it'll be kind of going in the other direction, like we saw with Sean Monahan. So the player would start out hot and kind of fade away. And from that, we can kind of do this, we can do some analyses on this metric for thousands of players and see if we have any predictive power here, if there's any trends, how it affects how NHL teams draft. And also one thing to note here is whenever I say PTV, point trend value, or rate of improvement, I always mean the exact same thing in this presentation. And so now that we have kind of the outline sorted out of how to calculate a point trend value, we can create a rough guideline for how to interpret them. So as you see here in this table on the right, I kind of gave a little guideline here. I'm not sure if my head's blocking it on your screen there. But I kind of laid it out into 5 different groups. You have strong increasing if the PTV is greater than 9.4, and then increasing if it's greater than 4.7, even if it's between negative and positive 4.7, decreasing if it's greater than or less than negative 4.7, and strong decreasing if it's less than negative 9.4. So that's basically just a rough guideline for how to interpret them based off just my experience of eyeballing the cumulative point curves and the corresponding point trend values, but it's not an end-all be-all way to interpret them. And if you look at the histogram here of all of the different point trend values for every player in the data set in both leagues, we can see between these two middle lines here in both leagues that majority of the players have an even trend. So there isn't a significant improvement or decline in their cumulative points over the year. And minority makes up the increasing and decreasing ranges, as you can see outside of that range. And overall, it looks like we have a normal distribution of point trend values among the league for all of you stats nerds out there, with a mean of about 0 and a standard deviation of about 4.7. And going back to our original example, we can now calculate the point trend value for our 3 players. So for Michael Scarboza, we have 11.5, and that's a strong increasing trend, as you can see here. His cumulative point production is getting better and better as the year goes on. Ryan Spooner has 3.7, which falls in that even trend range. As you can see, his curve is pretty straight the whole way through. And Sean Monahan is a negative 11.7. So he starts out hot and kind of fades down the stretch with a strong decrease in trend. And kind of exploring things, I found a little trend here within the age of point trend values. So if you divide each age group up, so we look at 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20-year-olds individually, we can see that the younger players kind of tend to have a higher mean point trend value. As you can see, the lower end, like the 16 and 17-year-olds veer away from 0. And with that, we can kind of see if that's statistically significant by using a 2-sample t-test. And I found that 16-year-olds in the OHL tend to improve at a higher rate on average than their older counterparts. And 16 and 17-year-olds in the WHL tend to improve at a higher rate than their older teammates. So the reasoning for that is likely because the younger players are usually rookies, so they're getting adjusted to the league. And also, coaches don't really put trust in rookies as much early on in the season, so they start to get more and more ice time and responsibility as the year goes on. And now we can look at the repeatability here. So we're going to look at 2 different methods of repeatability. The first is within season. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take the game log data for every player and divide it into 2 buckets, where bucket 1 is odd games, bucket 2 is even games. Then I'll calculate the point trend value for both buckets and plot them against each other. And as we can see here, it's pretty much a complete random scatter, other than in the bottom left and top right corners. There's a little bit of a clump there indicating that players with a very, very high point trend value or very low point trend value tend to have more repeatable results. And next we can look at the between season repeatability. And to do that, we're going to compare a player's point trend value in one year versus their point trend value in the next. And we can see here there's no correlation whatsoever, really, not even in the extreme ranges there. And so now we know there's not really any repeatability in this metric, but is there any predictive power on future results for it? So how I'm going to calculate that, I'm going to look at 3 different cases. The first being the CHL playoffs. So I'm going to look at the playoffs of the current season they're in. And how I'll do that is by comparing a player's playoff points per game divided by their regular season points per game versus their point trend value to see if they kind of showed an increased rate of points per game in the playoffs, and if that matches with their increased rate in point trend value or a high point trend value. And I'll do that for players with a minimum of 4 playoff games played. Next, I'll do the same thing for the following CHL season. So I'm going to divide their points per game in the following season by the current season for all players that have at least 30 games played in the next year. And then I'll compare that to their point trend value. And the third one is a bit more tricky, but not too difficult. I'm going to look at how they transition into pro hockey. So I'm going to take each player's adjusted NHL and AHL points per game in the following season. So that's adjusted by Rob Woolman's translation factor, just to account for the difference in difficulty between the leagues. And I'll divide that by their regular season points per game and compare it to their point trend value for all players that have at least 30 NHL and AHL games played in the following season. And first, looking at the playoffs here, you could see that it's pretty much a random scatter. There is a little bit of positive correlation, and we can kind of account for that by looking at just the strong increasing and strong decreasing PTVs. As you can see here, there is a bit of a difference, indicating that there may be a bit of a hot hand effect leading into the playoffs. However, there is a lot of overlap between these two groups, kind of indicating that we have to take that with a bit of a grain of salt. So, but there is a little bit of evidence there that there may be a hot hand effect. Now, looking at the following season, you can see that again, it's pretty much a random scatter, and the trend line is almost completely straight for both leagues. So there's not really any correlation here. And same thing, looking at how a player transitions into pro hockey, there is almost some negative correlation in the OHL, a little bit of positive correlation in the WHL, but overall, not a whole lot of evidence here as they're completely randomly scattered all over. So what can we take away from this? Is there any predictive power? What we can really say is that there may be a slight hot hand effect leading into the playoffs, and there's also little to no evidence that PTVs have any influence beyond the current season. And also, I should note that I did kind of break each of those graphs up by age to see if there was any trends, and I didn't find any, so I just kind of lumped them all together, mainly for simplicity and to save some time. And now we can get to the interesting part here. So I'm going to look at how point trend values influence how NHL teams draft. And as we've seen before, there's no repeatability in this metric, and there's no influence on future success. So there shouldn't really be any influence on how NHL teams draft these players. But if there is, then that kind of shows a sign that they are kind of putting higher stock in players that finish off the season strong, even though they really shouldn't be. And first, I'm just going to look at OHL draft eligible players and compare them by point trend value to see if there's any trends here. And the first step in doing that, I'm going to divide them into 5 different groups here based on their point trend value percentile. So I'll have group 1 being the 0 to 20th percentile, then 20th to 40th, then 40th to 60th, and so on. And I plotted out their draft pick versus their draft year points per game. Just to see if there's any kind of trends that appear here within each point trend value group. As you can see, it's pretty much a random scatter here, but I do want to take a bit of a closer look at these groups separated. And before I do that, this might be cut off here as well. I have the percentiles here, the 20th to 80th percentile, and they all range from roughly -3 to, I think, -3.8. So they're all within that even trend range. So I'm just going to merge them all together since there's not too much of a difference there. Then merge them into one group. So I'm going to be comparing 3 different groups, with one being the low extreme of point trend values, the second being kind of an even trend range, and the third being the 80th and above group. So players with a high point trend value. Separating up these graphs, you do see that there is a little bit of a micro trend in the 80th percentile and above group. As you can see, with players that are drafted in the first round with under a point per game, there's several of them there, while in the other groups, there is a couple that are in there, but just right along the edges. So I want to take a closer look at who these players are and see if there's a reason why teams are drafting these guys earlier. So as you can see by the table here, we have Scott Laughton, Bo Horvat, Lawson Krause, Zach Senyshyn, Ty Dellandrea, and Liam Foudy. And what I noticed right away with all these guys is that they did have underwhelming points per game for where they were drafted, but they also have some kind of intangible trait that boosted their value up beyond where it should have been if we were just looking at points. So, for example, Scott Laughton is a pretty gritty player. Lawson Krause is what they called every coach's dream in 2015. Then Liam Foudy is like the fastest man alive. So if you take all of those into account, we can see that teams do kind of tend to draw players a bit higher if they have some kind of intangible trait, even if their point trend values or their points per game are a bit underwhelming. And as we can see here, their point trend value looks like that may have an influence on why teams are drafting these guys earlier. So they see players that are kind of posting better offensive output in the second half of the year versus the first half of the year, and they kind of rationalize that it's okay to use a top 20 pick on them because they are increasing in their offensive production, even though I showed before that it really has no influence on future career success. And looking at two of these guys in particular, Liam Foudy and Zach Senyshyn, you can see their cumulative point curves here. And both had very similar paths to the NHL draft. So they both started off the season very slowly, as you can see in this first half here. Then they finished off on a tear, which kind of rose them up into kind of relevancy to be a first round pick. But even at the draft, both of these guys were projected to go in the second round. Then they were kind of picked a bit higher than they were ranked into the top 20 picks, with Foudy being 18th in 2018, Senyshyn being 15th in 2015. So it looks like teams are kind of reaching on these guys in hopes that they can continue at the pace they were at in the latter half of the year and even build upon that. Even though that we kind of showed before that there's no real evidence that this would be the case. And yeah, I just want to quickly go over Zach Senyshyn. And I'm a Leaf fan, so I never really get the chance to chirp Boston fans, but this case here is a great one too. So back in 2015, the Bruins had the 13th, 14th, and 15th overall pick, and that gave birth to this tweet here. Boston could get Barzal, Connor, and Shillington here. They ended up taking Jacob Zaboral, Jake DeBrusk, and Zach Senyshyn, of course. When the next three picks right after that ended up being Matt Barzal, Kyle Connor, and Thomas Chabot, 3 NHL stars. And yeah, my chances to take shots at the Bruins are few and far between, so I have to take them while I can get them. So now looking beyond that kind of micro trend there, we want to look if there's any overall trends in how players are drafted based on their point trend value. As you can see here, in the average draft pick by the three groups, we can see that players that are in the 80th percentile and above of PTVs are drafted earlier on average than the rest. So then we can look at other reasons why this might be the case, such as the percentage of players in each group that are drafted. That's pretty constant. And then the average points per game by group, that's pretty constant as well. The 80th to 20th group is a little bit lower at 0.8 versus 0.84 for the other two. So that may come into account a bit in lowering. So the average draft pick here may be a little bit lower, but overall it looks like there's likely a difference in average draft pick in this group versus the others. And I did the 2 sample t-test for this as well to see if there's a statistically significant difference here. And I didn't find any evidence that there was like a truly statistically significant difference here. But what we can say is that it's likely that players in the 80th and above percentile group are picked up earlier on average than players in the other groups among OHL draft eligible players. And now I'm going to go to the WHL. So I'm just going to skip right ahead here to looking for any trends here with first round picks with under a point per game. As you can see, that trend kind of faded away a bit here. This is partially because players in the WHL are drafted on average a bit later, so we won't see as many players in the first round. And there is one player that falls within this range, who is Curtis Lazar, drafted 17th in 2015, who fits kind of that two-way player role that the other guys fit in the OHL. But overall, that trend kind of evaporates in the WHL. And looking for an overall trend here, we can see that the average draft pick between the three groups in the WHL is now kind of shrunken, or the difference between them is shrunken quite a bit. So now it's only a 5 pick difference between the 20th to 80th percentile group and the 80th and above group. And obviously there's no statistically significant difference there. And yeah, so it's kind of weird that this trend fades away in the WHL. My reasoning for that would likely be partially because of a bit of randomness and why that happened in the OHL. And also because the OHL is one of the most highly scrutinized and analyzed junior leagues in the world, or well, it is the most highly analyzed junior league in the world. So teams may have better data on the players and may overanalyze a bit and pick players who finish off stronger in the second half earlier more often than in the WHL. And yeah, so that's all the analysis I have today. So now I want to go over why this is important. So I'm going to go back to that original quote I had. So I'm just going to take the last sentence there. If they were unable to increase their performance as they should have become more used to the team and league, if they didn't pick up their pace when the chips were down, it doesn't augur well for an NHL future. And what I did in this presentation was kind of ask the questions of if this is true, and if people believe this is true, by first looking if a player's rate of improvement in a season has any predictive power on future results. And I found that there isn't really any, so there's no correlation between how a player improves in one season and their actual results in the next. And also, I wanted to see if teams drafted players with higher rates of improvement earlier. And I found that they do a little bit, especially in the OHL, where we have a bunch of players that are being drafted in the first round with under a point per game. So these guys are being taken a bit higher than they really should be, when they should probably be somewhere in the later, like the very end of the first round or somewhere in the second round. And also overall, it looks like there is a bit of a trend that OHL draft eligible players are being selected a bit higher on average if they have a higher point trend value throughout the year. And so how is this work useful? So I'm going to break down how it's useful for a few different types of people here. The first is for hockey analytics researchers. So this kind of provides a framework for future related work. Everything I did here isn't perfect. We can improve upon some things, such as the main thing is that points aren't a very repeatable statistic themselves. So we can't really tell too much from just points alone, but it is like the best option that we have at the junior hockey level. So it would be interesting to explore in the future how trend values or how exploring trend values into different metrics, such as something like expected goals for that's more repeatable. And also the quadratic model has a bit of flaws in it. It can't really describe a player's cumulative point production well over the years if it bounces up and down a lot. And also if a player has a higher total points or a higher games played or a lower games played, then this kind of influences the point trend value. So that kind of like overestimates or underestimates the value of it as well. So those are some limitations to build upon. And obviously this can be transferable into different sports as well. We can look at like points in basketball or some kind of expected goals in soccer, stuff like that. For fans, we can use this as a descriptive metric to measure a player's rate of improvement over a season. I want to emphasize that it's descriptive and not predictive because as we've seen, there's no predictive power on this metric on future results. And also the cumulative point charts are just kind of fun to look at and it's fun to interpret. And for NHL personnel, we kind of see a bit of evidence here in drafting bias based on point trend values. So that could be something for GMs to potentially be aware of when they're on the draft floor, that they're not selecting a player based on their strong second half, since there isn't really a whole lot of evidence that this has any results on future success. And also it could help scouts get an understanding of the lack of significance in a player heating up or cooling down late in the season. And lastly, for CHL personnel, we kind of found a way to describe the rate of improvement and how it differs by age in junior hockey. So we see that younger players tend to improve a bit more, especially rookies. And also the lack of correlation between PTVs and success in the following season can help GMs in making and evaluating trade offers and just give them a bit more of a 360 view of what they're doing. And that's everything I have today. So thank you all so much for listening. Thank you, Alyssa, so much for having me here today. If you liked my presentation or didn't like it, or just had any comments at all, feel free to contact me or ask a question here. and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can.
So thank you, Brendan, for giving that presentation. I think the chat is still recovering from everyone in the Massachusetts area being reminded that Boston really could have done that, and like you didn't.
Yeah.
But anyway, we are going to head to our next talk and our final, I guess, actual presentation of the day, with a talk and a panel left to go. Oh, give me a second. I will cut. There we go.
Hi. Sorry about that. We had a bit of a webcam fiasco, so this is why we're a little bit delayed. And so yeah, I'll try and get it started and get through this thing relatively quickly. So what we've done is sort of a fairly sort of a comprehensive analysis of 3 different components of passing. Whether it's the difficulty, the value, or the tendencies in hockey. And this was really a collaborative effort between myself, Paul, Connor, and Sam. I couldn't convince Connor or Paul to join us on a lovely spring weekend, but Sam is, we're fortunate enough to have Sam with us here at ISOLHAC. So this is really great. And if you were at CBJ Hack or followed online, like this is going to be the same presentation. So if you want a little bit of time back in your day, feel free to take a break if you've already seen that presentation. So getting into the slides a little bit, we're going to go through sort of why we care about passing, look at these 3 different sort of models or components of passing, whether it's tendencies, difficulty, or value. And then we're going to sort of try and wrap things up a little bit and show a demo of a sort of a dashboard application that we built in-house. So getting into it a little bit, so this is the SportLogic data set. Having heard, all the difficulties of tracking data manually out in the public, like, we definitely are very fortunate to work with such an extensive data set. So in addition to the standard stuff that you see in the sort of the NHL RTSS data, we also collect the locations and timestamps on things like passes and receptions. Checks, which are sort of these events where a player dispossesses another player of a puck, as well as LPRs, which are loose puck recoveries, and the locations of zone exits and entries as well. And our coverage now extends to the NHL and the AHL, the Swedish Elite League, or the Swedish League, as well as the 4 major junior leagues in North America. So the CHL plus the USHL. The reason we started, we wanted to sort of work on passes was just because of sample size. So there's roughly 900 passes in an NHL game, and every pass is actually composed of 2 events. So there's the pass and then the reception. So this is a lot more data than obviously shot attempts. And in fact, there's 3,600 events in a game. So passes between the starts and end actually make up almost exactly half of all the events that we track in a game. So we figured it was time to start working on analyses that could better leverage this data set. From a purely sort of like hockey standpoint, and I picked this GIF for CBJ Hack, obviously, so hopefully I don't offend too many Lightning fans here. But oftentimes the pass will create the space and sort of the goalie movement that can actually sort of result in really good scoring opportunities. I think this is something that touches on what Thibaut addressed earlier in the first talk of the day. So it's nice to kind of come full circle in that way. So this is definitely another reason we want to look at passing. The questions we'd like to answer are sort of what tendencies do teams or players have? And we do this using pass clustering. We also wanted to look at sort of the difficulty of a pass. So trying to build a model to evaluate the difficulty of a pass based on the data that we have. And finally, we wanted to sort of understand what the value of a pass is. And this we did using sort of the expected threat model that Sam created. So each of these models might actually take up a full 20-minute talk. So we're going to have to jump through some of the technical details. Unlike at CBJHack, like we don't have Josh and Luke, who did some great work sort of presenting different sort of machine learning techniques ahead of time. So it will feel a little bit fast if you're not familiar with the concepts. Fortunately, like, we're not going to get too heavy into all these machine learning algorithms or the complicated math, and we're going to try and focus on sort of presenting some of the results. So with pass clustering, the reason we sort of need pass clustering can sort of easily be illustrated here. So this is just Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals last year. And like on the left, you see the number of shots that were taken. So they fall kind of nicely into two different areas of the ice, and there's not so many of them, maybe 100 or so. And on the right are the passes, and passes are actually even more tricky to analyze than shots, because they are these two-dimensional vectors. So you can't even easily visualize high numbers of passes using standard things like contour maps or heat maps in the same way that you can do with shots, because you need to be able to represent this sort of directional component. So the approach that we took is something we sort of copied from this work that had been done in soccer, and now recently has also been done for hockey, which is we're using an algorithm called k-means clustering to group passes into k number of clusters. Determining the number of clusters was a little bit of an art in that, it's a bit of an art, but we ended up going with 50 clusters for even strength and 30 clusters for power play, just because there are fewer pass types on the power play. And this algorithm basically like aims to minimize the within cluster variance, and so it learns sort of what these clusters are on its own. One thing we did was we enforced mirroring we mirrored these passes to enforce symmetry. So this is what the raw data would have looked like, where there are passes on both sides of the ice. When you mirror them, we took all of these passes and sort of flipped them onto the top, and then we cluster these passes, and then we cluster the passes on the mirrored passes, but then we can still assign the maroon pass to a different cluster. So we had 50 clusters, so the 51st cluster is the mirror of cluster 1. And this is sort of what passing tendencies look like at the team level. So what we basically did was looked at the league average percent of passes in each cluster, and then looked at the standard deviations from that for a given team relative to league average. So red basically means that a team passes or makes that pass a lot, and blue means that they make that pass less than league average. So you can kind of see some interesting patterns here. Teams that have a lot more ozone time tend to be redder, in certain areas, and teams, unfortunately, like Sam's favorite team, Detroit, do not. Moving on into pass difficulty. What we wanted to do was find a better way of evaluating how difficult a pass is, because pass completion percentage doesn't really tell you a whole lot. What you actually see if you just kind of take a really quick look at pass completion percentage by position or by zone is that, in the D zone, you're more likely to complete your passes than in the O zone. And if you're a goalie, so goalies are making a lot of these really short passes behind the net to their defensemen. If you're a goalie, you tend to have much higher pass completion percentage, and defensemen also have higher completion percentages than forwards, because they're generally speaking making safer passes. So this is why sort of just looking at raw pass completion percentage is not ideal. So what we did instead is sort of copying some of the work that we'd done on building expected goals models. You can kind of imagine that the same framework applies to passes, where a pass, just like a goal, just like a shot, can either end up in a goal, or which is a successful shot, or in the case of a pass, it can either be sort of a successful pass or a failed pass. And we basically built a model that looks at sort of passer location, receiver location, some elements of game context, and also sort of the pre-pass movement. So what happens before this pass, and fed it into these models to try and figure out, to try and build out a model to value expected pass completion. And what we these are just some sort of results where we sort of built a naive model, which is just looking at league average passing, and then that was sort of the baseline, and that had 72% accuracy. And we built out two models. This model is sort of like a pretty standard machine learning model, and it produced slightly better, noticeably better results than the logistic regression model that we also tried. What this graph shows is basically if the model predicts that a pass is 20% likely to be completed, it actually is, in fact, roughly 20% likely to be completed, and sort of going up the line. So it looks like it's a fairly well-calibrated model. And yeah, I think I'm going a little bit high on time, so I might just leave this slide. Relatively, I don't know how much I can cover on this slide, but these are some of the features on our model, and they sort of behave as you would expect. So if you are further away from the goal, your chances of completing the pass are higher. If you're closer to the goal, it's harder to pass. Obviously, the closer you get to your opponent's net. And this is sort of a way, these SHAP plots are a way for us to sort of figure out if the model that we've built is actually producing sensible sort of, is doing it in sort of a sensible way. And yeah, I'll turn it over to Sam now, who's going to talk about passing value. So just let me know when to skip slides.
Thanks, Dave. And thanks, Alyssa, for having me and setting this whole thing up. Yeah, like Dave said, I'm going to be talking about the pass value section, which I'm going to be doing through the lens of an expected threat model. If you want to jump to the next slide now. So yeah, the concept of expected threat, I'll do sort of a brief overview on this. First, I want to give credit for the inspiration for this model. So it's inspired by work that Karun Singh has done in soccer. So trying to borrow some work that's been done from other sports and build on it. So what expected threat basically is a model that assigns a value to every possession event, so except shots, so passes or basically dump-ins or a player carrying the puck from point A to point B, based on the probability that that event leads to scoring or conceding a goal in the near future. So why do we want this model? Dave touched on this a little bit, but currently available metrics that we lean on, like expected goals, are really only looking at shots, so you're leaving the importance of over 95% of these events unmeasured. And how this works, again, we don't have a ton of time to get into the nitty-gritty details, but expected threat is a location-based Markov model that relies on event-level data. So I know that's kind of a mouthful, but basically what that means is a player at any point on the ice has a few choices. They can shoot the puck, they can move the puck from one location to another, and if they move the puck, they can either do that successfully and maintain possession for their team through a pass or a carry, or they can turn the puck over. So that's kind of the derivation in simplest terms of this model, as you see there outlined in green and in red. Expected threat basically boils down to the probability at any point that you score by shooting, the probability that you move the puck, and then your team scores, minus the probability of turning the puck over and having your opponent score. So the interpretation of that is pretty nice. The X threat value of an event represents the change in the probability of your team scoring minus the change in the probability of the other team scoring. So you can kind of think about that as like an expected goal differential. So it's kind of nice it breaks down into that percentage change, basically. We can move to the next slide, Dave. Yeah, so this here on the right is just a visual of how it breaks down on the ice. Unsurprisingly, threat is primarily concentrated in the slot area. And as you can see, it sort of slowly diminishes as you move back into the neutral zone. and defensive zone, moving from left to right there. What's actually interesting about this is the lightest shaded areas, sort of deep in your, when you're hemmed deep in your own zone, these actually have a negative value once you build. So one of the improvements or additions we made onto work that had been done in the past is building in this sort of penalty term for the likelihood of a turnover on a given play. So what's interesting is that those lightest shaded areas actually have negative value, even if you have possession. So in your own zone, there may be times where you have possession in your own zone, and it's actually more likely that the other team scores in the near future than you do, even though you're the team in possession. So just want to kind of highlight that there. We can jump to the next slide. So here, what we're showing here is sort of combining the expected threat with expected pass values, again, with this comprehensive analysis of passing. So you have X threat on the X-axis, expected pass on the Y-axis, and the color is expected pass rating, which is basically pass completion relative to expected. So green would be completing more passes more passes than expected, and vice versa. And defensemen are shown on top there and forwards on the bottom. I think a few interesting things really jump out here. So for one, you can see there's this clear positional difference, both in the difficulty and the value of these passes. So as Dave touched on earlier, defensemen in general are making easier passes. They're not making as many passes deep in the offensive zone, which are much more difficult to complete. But you can also see that defensemen are shifted far more over to the right, meaning that on average, they're also completing more valuable passes or potentially turning the puck over less. So this, I think, there are two potential explanations for this. One is that forwards are turning the puck over more and getting penalized with negative threat values for that, which I think is reasonable. But I think secondly, this also points out a pretty crucial limitation of expected threat in its current form as a purely location-based model, where, as you saw before, threat is so concentrated in the slot and around the net. And if you're just basically the only features, as it were, built into this model are the location of the play. So anytime you're making a pass that actually carries the puck farther away from the net, I mean, anyone can imagine sort of a cross crease play or any play where it's beneficial to move the puck back to the point, for example. It doesn't take into account any of that situational context. So any pass that moves the puck away from the net is assigned a negative value, which I think is one pretty significant limitation to these location-based models, and one reason that I've kind of started working on some other approaches, whether that's expanding the state space of a Markov model or building more of a robust classification model to solve the same type of problem. We can jump to the next slide. So again, this presentation is primarily focused on passing, but as I said, expected threat assigns values to all possession events. So we can actually break this down. Another nice property is we can break this down into passing versus carrying. So that's what you see here with passing on the X-axis and carrying on the Y. The color here just represents kind of their usage difficulty in terms of like a strength differential. So if your strength of teammate is better than your strength of opposition on average, you're shown in blue. Red would be that your opposition is stronger. So what's interesting here, again, we sort of have that limitation where a lot of these forwards are clustered on the negative side, but I think in relative terms, it still makes a lot of sense. So you can see exceptional puck carriers like McKinnon and McDavid for forwards, and then Roman Josi for defensemen standing out there. You can see sort of the more offensive defensemen like a Burns, a Riley, D'Angelo this season standing out on the right. And then you see sort of grinding type players like a Reeves or a Paul Byron down in the bottom left. So we've kind of vetted this model, looking at it in aggregate, and the results kind of align with intuition about what skills these players have, which is nice. And we can jump to the next slide. So another nice property about this, in addition to breaking up by component, pass versus carry, is we can also identify where on the ice these players generate value. So these are just a few examples that I pulled that prove pretty instructive. So as you see so I guess to take a step back, how these are generated is basically the starting point of a player's event. At that location, how much value they generate relative to league average for their position, red being more and blue being less. So going from left to right here, you see obviously McDavid is basically a sea of red. He's generating a lot of threat, both with his feet as well as with his passing ability. On passes, what's interesting is I imagine a lot of this value deep in the offensive zone coming from potentially him wheeling wide, coming around the net, and setting up his teammates from there. Carry, it's pretty red all over the ice. He's generating more through the neutral zone as well as in the offensive zone than a lot of players. Again, what's nice about being able to break it up by the type of event is you see someone like Joe Thornton that at this stage in his career is a pretty one-dimensional player. He still has that passing acumen that he's known for, but basically on the carry side of things, he's slowed down a bit with age and he's not generating a lot carrying the puck compared to other forwards in the league. Burns, everyone knows how Brent Burns plays and all the offense that he generates there from that right point. So you can see that sort of hotspot both for passing, whether those are actual passes or shots for tips or anything like that. He's generating a lot from that point, and then also carrying the puck. He likes to play like a bit of a rover or forward, and also tends to carry the puck in deep and towards the slot from that same point location. And then again, Yossi, you can see carrying the puck up the left side of the ice. Yeah, I guess we're pretty short on time. That's all from me, but would be happy to take any questions at the end or talk more in depth later on. Thanks.
No, we can do questions. Give me a second. Let me find them.
Oh, we haven't quite wrapped up yet, but how are you doing for time? I can.
No, you can have another 10 minutes. I still do not know if the twins are awake. Can someone please confirm if the twins have woken up? It's giving me stress.
Yeah, sorry, that was just all from me. Dave has the rest of the way to go here.
I just can't listen. That's fine. I'll be quiet then.
Cheers. Cool. So yeah, trying to put it all together. We've obviously covered a lot of different things. So there's kind of like what you can do, which is nice with the clustering, is that you can actually look at sort of difficulty and value by cluster, and some of these results are pretty intuitive. Where red means it's higher value, blue means it's lower value, and you can see that these passes in the offensive zone are generally, especially the ones closer to the net or into the slot, generate higher value, whereas these passes sort of along the blue line are actually, or back towards the point, are generating lower or even negative value. And you can see that, outside of the offensive zone, everything's, relatively flat in terms of the expected threat profile. But you can see that some of these forward passes into the neutral zone, sort of these outlet passes, are generating positive threat, while some of these drop passes are generating negative threat. What you can also see when you look at the expected pass completion percentage is that these sort of tougher passes here, right, near the net in the O zone, are much harder to complete than these passes that are sort of backwards or further away from the net. So that's why. So this is kind of an intuitive notion that we can actually quantify. What we looked at here is just basically doing a correlation between the expected threat value and the expected pass value by these different clusters. And what we see is that, there is this negative correlation, which means that the more valuable a pass is, the harder it is to complete. And really that just means that, defenses are sort of doing their jobs, right? One thing we should mention is that a lot of this work was actually inspired by this passing dashboard that Devin Ployler at Toronto Football Club, TFC, had shown us that this is a tool that they use internally, and I can sort of launch that here. The idea behind this is to sort of build a tool that makes it easier to analyze passes. So, I've got Winnipeg up here on the power play. This is sort of the classic Blake Wheeler to Patrick Laine, or to nobody pass from the right corner. This is also an outlet pass that they do a lot, where Neil Pionk, who's a right-handed defenseman, likes to pass it to one of their forwards. We can really look at any sort of team that we'd like. And we can look at both even strength and on the power play. I'm not sure what team to go for here, because we don't really have a home crowd, but I feel like the Toronto Maple Leafs might be something that people can take a look at or get mad at me about. So apparently this is what they do a lot on the even strength, and they actually make a lot of these passes from the left into the slot. And this is actually coming mostly from Marner or Riley, actually. and doesn't complete all that often necessarily. But let's take a look at maybe some of the ones that do. So that filter just basically takes out all of the unsuccessful passes, and hopefully this link works. Oh, gotta log in. Does this work? Oh, yeah. So again, this is going to be hopefully passes from, right. Yeah, and the idea behind this tool is to make it easier for teams like video coaches, especially, to pre-scout their opponents. Well, this is obviously a very different situation, but you guys sort of get the idea. So yeah, that's the passing dashboard. Oh, sorry. Yeah, just wanted to acknowledge my co-authors here. Paul actually did a lot of the work on the clustering, as well as building sort of out the first version of the dashboard. Connor worked a lot on the expected pass model, building out the final version of that. And Sam, who you heard from, obviously, is the primary person on the expected threat models. In terms of yeah, like none of this stuff is actually really novel. Like all of this stuff has actually been done before. So just wanted to cite our references here. A lot of our inspiration came from soccer, but in recent I guess months, there's been sort of an expected pass model that's been done for hockey by Mark Richards that was presented at RITSAC. Karun is the inspiration, the main inspiration behind the expected threat models, but there are others. And Nathan Delara, who won the CBJ-HAC data competition, had actually built an expected threat model for hockey, also at RITSAC. And in terms of clustering, Dan Weinberger has actually done some really nice work using, I think it's KHL data for pass clustering. But we were originally sort of taking a look at some of the stuff that had been done in soccer. Yeah, so yeah, I'll turn it over to questions if there's time. Otherwise, I'm happy to answer on Twitter or something along those lines.
There's only one I can see at the moment. It says, have you found any significant differences between data from the NHL / USA Canadian leagues and the SHL?
Sam, should I take this one?
Yeah, you go for it.
Okay, sure. Yeah, we haven't actually done the analysis for the SHL for the passing stuff. In the past, when we've looked at, we've done some work on sort of like pace of play and stuff. There were definitely differences in, yeah, the amount. There's definitely differences going from North American ice to European ice, where there's usually more passing in Europe, and the time that people hang onto the puck is a little bit longer. So there are some interesting differences that can be quantified from this data. We just haven't had a chance to do it yet for passing, but that's a really good question.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and presenting. For those currently wondering what's next, we have how to build a stats website, which I feel is going to kind of wrap up everything. If you've come through the entire weekend with 1,000 good ideas and are feeling particularly inspired, this might be for you. So we're going to go to a very short break and we'll be back in a moment.
We live?
Yes.
Oh,
All right. Well, so I guess I'll start. My name is Josh.
I'm Luke.
And we collectively, the creators and the maintainers of evolvinghockey.com. I'm Josh. I think I'm on the left, correct? And then
Luke's over here.
Yeah,
Don't worry about it.
Just to clarify, but yeah, we are the Evolving Wild Twins on Twitter as well.
I'm Brad. I'm the creator of Natural Stat Trick.
My name is Matt Barlow. I created the NBA stats website, theseventhman.net. That's kind of what I do. And I also work for a little-known company as the National Hockey League. So that's my day job.
So yeah, I guess that Brad, I don't know if you've been around kind of longer than any of us in terms of, running a site and whatever, but we have, I believe Evolving Hockey went live in its first iteration about almost 2 years ago. It was a much slimmer version. It was didn't have nearly as much stuff on it, but that was kind of our first iteration, and then we redesigned it last summer.
Yeah.
And then we've kind of been slowly adding more stuff, but for the most part it's kind of maintained the same form. So I think, Brad, you've been around for, what has it been? I don't even know how long you've been hosting Natural Stat Trick.
Almost 6 years.
Okay.
Launched late September 2014.
Yeah. And then Matt, you've had yours up for, is it a little less than a year?
No, it's a little over a year. I just got the bill from AWS to renew my domain. So it's the only reason I know.
Yeah, because Brad, you've seen quite a few different websites come and go over the years, and we've kind of only been doing this for, less than 2 years. Because when you started, was Extra Skater still around?
No, that was, I started in the aftermath of Extra Skater going offline. Right. That was that summer. I launched, I couldn't tell you the order anymore, but within about 2 or 3 days of each other, I launched, War on Ice launched, and hockeystats.ca launched. Okay.
So that was kind of back when there were multiple. I guess there's multiple because we still have, I guess it's interesting because there always seem to be some sites that pop up for a specific thing. Like, for instance, when we first started our site, it was almost specifically just because we got sick of hosting our like GAR war data in a Google sheet. That was kind of where it came from, was that we initially made a couple, we would do some stuff, but for the most part, Manny and Corsica kind of did a lot of the stuff that we kind of were also interested. So we would use that, and then we had our own models, and so we would just put that out there in a Google sheet. And that was kind of, I'm kind of curious, Brad, was there a reason why you kind of got into it? Or was it just some interest, or was it kind of just a hobby, or?
Well, I started building the back end of it just for personal use. There were just a couple ways of looking at the data. Extra Skater was still fairly new at the time and was really kind of pushing that forward. But there were a couple ways of looking at the data that they weren't providing. And so I was building that database for my own use for that. And then when they went offline in the summer, I kind of had, a scraper and a database ready to go.
Yeah, because it seems kind of like that's the one of the ways that a lot of sites start up is it's maybe more, you used a site and then you got into it and had maybe your own database, or you had your own things that you kind of wanted to look at. And then one of them inevitably goes down and you're like, well, what the heck, I guess I'll just, give it a go. I guess, Matt, though, yours was almost entirely just kind of just a pure hobby, just to see, work on some NBA stuff, because you're not really able to do the NHL stuff in the public site kind of thing.
Yeah. So before I was hired, I just redid my entire database of NHL stats and was about to build a front end to build another website. It was basically around the same time you guys were going to come out with Evolving Hockey. I was going to build something similar just for practice to the front end. So, but then I got hired, so that kind of put a spike into that. And so then I had obviously still wanted to remain in the public sphere and talk about sports analytics. So I had to pick another sport. So I picked NBA because there was some other resources available seemed to be a little bit more data for it than opposed. Like NFL was still kind of getting started with their stuff. MLB is there, but I'm not the biggest baseball fan, so I chose NBA because I like to watch it. So then I built my database, my scraper. Once I had my scraper, built my database, and then once I did that, I built the front end on it that's there today. So it was basically just channeling, like basically what I would have been doing for hockey, but just redirected into NBA stuff.
Yeah, and I guess I'm curious because I think we all do use a different language or a different kind of backend, and I would assume our databases are probably somewhat similar, but because we use Shiny, which
I always say I'm a fake web developer because I use Shiny, which is our Shiny package, which is a very kind of it's very unique suite of kind of functions that allows you to build a website using R, which is most people would say is really interesting. I think that's what Corsica was made was with Shiny, and there's a lot of applications that are made using Shiny. It's
mostly War and Ice too. The main kind of the meat of War and Ice was also Shiny. It was through R. It was a much earlier version of Shiny. They've kind of beefed up what you can do with Shiny, but it's not for. I guess the simple way to say is that Shiny is not necessarily meant to have say 100 hundreds of users. It's meant for a small like maybe a research team or some kind of
like data sharing just to make it easier so it's been kind of a funny journey because like I don't I'll talk to or I'll read stuff about creating a front end, and it's like I don't really have any idea what that means because I'm using a completely different framework for building a website. I mean, I think it's a good thing. It's that like you can do it using R because I don't really know any. I mean, I've learned as we've gone through it, I've learned a lot more HTML and CSS and some JavaScript, not really, but mostly it's just been in Shiny. But I know like Brad, like I think you do proper, I mean, both you guys probably do a little bit more proper website building than we're doing over here.
Because Brad, are you in mostly, do you say PHP or?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm running what they call, for those who are familiar, it's a LAMP environment. So Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP.
Okay.
Yeah, and we use Postgres as our backend, so that's mostly what we're using.
And it's DigitalOcean is our kind of our servers, but I mean it's that was because there's a lot of R stuff. I mean we're not proper.
Yeah, I think like for like Matt, like I remember you kind of mentioning how you wanted to kind of build a website just as like a learning experience, which I think is a really good just to do something to kind of like, get yourself familiar with it and kind of gain more experience. I think it's a great like kind of project.
Well, because how long did it take? I'm curious with both of you, and I guess we could talk about it too. How long do you think from start to finish? Obviously, it's still in working, but where the point at which you were able to like launch fully, Matt? Like it took you a while, didn't it?
It took about 6 months, I want to say. Well, that's just building the website was 6 months. The data and the scraper and doing all that stuff was like probably another year, maybe put into it. No, maybe it was 6 months. I don't know. I have to look at my Git history, but about a year total. 6 months to build the scraper, 6 months to build the front end. I'm pretty sure I launched at the beginning of last NBA or roughly when the NBA season started last year. So about a year, give or take. Because, I mean, there's a lot of stuff like, building a website covers such a broad topic of tech areas. Like you got like HTML, like which is what most main people see, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And then you've got the back end where the data, which is usually a database, it could be something else. And then you've got, you also need to learn how to deploy those things to where anyone can connect to it at any time, like like a website. And so you're kind of juggling a lot of different balls in the air to get a fully functioning website. You touch on a lot of different topics, and so it's a good way to like learn a bunch of different stuff. Like if you want to get out of your programming, like before that I was mainly like just doing Python scripting, scraping and database work. And so, but it helps you like get out of that, if that was your comfort zone, that definitely helped me get it out, start learning more about how like websites interact with each other, what DNS actually is, IP addresses, kind of how the web works, which is just completely different than if you're just coding on your own machine. It's just a completely different world.
Yeah, I mean, it was for us and we still don't really know. I mean, a lot of this stuff is very Chinese specific, but I remember when we first had to, because to kind of deploy our server and get it set up and linked to our domain and all that kind of stuff, and work with Nginx and the random different kind of terminal languages that I don't really know very well, and that was very much a learning experience that I still, but it's definitely, it gets you into, like, because Matt, like you said, is that there are, you're working, it depends on what your structure is, but you have to do, at least probably a little HTML, CSS, JavaScript, you have probably your main developing language, you have some kind of SQL, you have some other terminal language probably, or, Unix or Linux that you're working with. And it kind of really does, you're working with a lot of different areas. I'm kind of curious, Brad, because you, I'm curious how much you think National Static has changed in the 6 years that you've been maintaining, because we're not even on 2 years and you're 3 times that. I mean, I'm curious, like, what you've added or what's changed, or how it's different is now than when you first launched.
It's a lot different. Going back, let's see, the features were fairly simple. There was the game report, missing a lot of the features it has right now. It took me over a year after launching to be able to get the WoWies to generate at a speed where I could do it during a game. So just it's the basic structure hasn't changed that much. The database has been redesigned a couple times, and it's just been a lot of feature on top of feature kind of thing.
Yeah, I would say that's, I mean, Luke can talk about it, but that's kind of, it seems like that's the process for most people, is once you get to a point that's you're launching and people can use it, and then most of the time is, it's not like we have a team. I mean, for us, we're lucky because there's 2 of us, but for most people, it's mostly just one person. So you kind of have, I feel like, a long running list of things that are, features that get added, right? And you kind of work on one, and then you work on another, and they over years just ends up getting added to the site.
All right, so we got some questions, or maybe, so I guess so one thing was talk about our different approaches to building a website, like what software. We already kind of but I guess from an approach standpoint, I think that this can kind of get tied in as for instance, I use our website all the time. And I think that's I really kind of made it.
You mean just
to building a website, what are our approaches to it? Because I think, so for me, it's really important, I think, from a front end perspective, is that, just if you're looking or trying, some things that I guess I think about is that it's just the user experience. And I think that if you don't use your website, you would have no idea what what is going to go wrong, or what is going to be kind of a hold up or something. So I think that's something that I've seen.
Well, Matt has said this before, is for us, he's joked about how we just use our site to dunk on other people or something, which is and that's, honestly, that's a motivation for a lot of people who want to go onto a hockey site, if they're on Twitter, is just to go prove someone wrong quickly, right? And so you kind of, part of the user experience is that you need to allow people to go and find what they're looking for kind of quickly, right? And so for us, that's been something that we've kind of taken into account a little bit more. I'm curious if there's any other different approaches that you guys have in your user experience approach, or do you I don't know, reach out to, do you do surveys, do you ask questions of other people, or is it kind of just you just do it? And
I just kind of do it, and when somebody does come back with feedback, I try and look at that and see what's going on. One thing I found probably about a year and a half in, I found out that almost nobody knew that you could get WoWies from my site outside of the game reports, because they were buried 6-7 steps in to the website.
Yeah.
So that was a bit of a learning experience there, and it's okay, cut down the number of steps to get anything, make sure that people can actually find the features that you're putting on the website.
Yeah, I mean, Matt, so another question was, what advice would you give somebody who's kind of getting into making a website? And I'm kind of curious because you have really went from not, doing necessarily a web design or development as your day job per se to running a full site. I'm kind of curious what your, I guess, advice on starting a website or getting into that process would be.
That's a good question. Let me see if I can think of any. If you're going to start building a website, you need to start with like HTML. Like you need to know the basics of HTML. You need to know the basics of CSS. I don't even say you need to know JavaScript that much, but you need to know like at least how to copy and paste it and to get it to do what you want to do. So you need to know those basics first, because that's how you're going to display it. Then the second thing would be then you need to get what you're going to display. Like in this case, it's data. So then most of us being data oriented, we created the data first because we're not, or at least I'm not a front end developer. So we had the data and then we built the front end second. Some people, so if you're going to build a website, you need to know the HTML stuff, and then you got to have something to show. So you got to know how to get the data. And I guess that goes into building scrapers. So like the best way to get data is to build a scraper. Depends on what data you want to get. And obviously, I gave a talk a couple weeks ago that a lot of ways to get data is through APIs. Like Spotify has an API, Facebook has API, Twitter has APIs. And so you could get data from these things to build then your website on. Obviously, this is sports related, so most people want sports data. So the NBA has an API. So that's where I build my website off of, or get the data from. My scraper connects to that API and pulls the data down. So if you're wanting to build a scraper, then you either most likely need to learn Python or R, just because it goes into so much of working with the data forward. I know Natural Stat Trick, didn't you build yours in PHP, your scraper?
Yep.
Brad?
Yeah, the only a little bit of Python for the expected goals model, because PHP can't quite handle linear regression.
Yeah.
But everything else in the scraper is PHP.
Yeah, so PHP is perfectly fine too. I just started out with Python because it just connected in with the stuff I was doing with the analytics already. But yeah, PHP is fine for front end stuff. It's still well used, still widely popular. But I just chose Python because it connected in with what I was already doing.
And I'll just kind of add on.
Same way.
Too, I was going to just say is that the scraper aspect was kind of new for us. When we first started, we were lucky because Manny had his open source kind of NHL scraper we could kind of dig through, and ours.
Creator of Corsica.
Manny Perry, and so part of it was like when we kind of learned it, when you scrape a website or you learn how to scrape something, it gives you a lot of kind of a look at how websites work in the first place, which I think is also a good way to get into building one, is because when you start to scrape, you kind of need to identify what is going on the website. And for us, we didn't really know that. So our first foray into scraping was just looking to see like, I want this table or I want this thing from this one website. How do I get there? And so you go down the route of, for us, it was just inspecting.
Yeah, but I think also like if you're looking, I'm sure that there's other type of scrapers out there for other languages, but I just know like War on Ice, their scraper for getting was a package. What was it called?
I think it was just called
NHL Scrape R.
Yeah, it was like the NFL.
I think it might be deprecate, or like it might be on CRAN for the R, like holding the package. I don't know if it's been maintained, but they put their scraper on CRAN and it was all open source. And so that was, I think, a big help for us when we were learning. So I guess if you're looking to make a scraper, I would try to find an example of something that's open source.
Does Harry Schomer still have a Python scraper? I know he used to have one out there. I'm not sure if it's still open. Do you know, Matt?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Yeah. But I guess for anybody who's looking to get into or, you know, learn about it or try to use one or make their own. I think there are several, and it's not just hockey or sports. I mean, I'm sure that you can go on GitHub or Google and find an open source just scraper for something.
Well, yeah, and I think one of the easiest things is, well, I don't know if you should, but like Hockey Reference, for instance, is a really easy website to kind of, because they have tables, like HTML tables, so you can really, it's a very simple like process, and you can just kind of do a quick scrape to get certain data from there. And I think just if you're looking to build it, I would just start really small, start with one page.
Yeah,
and
like don't try and scrape, you know, all of Wikipedia or all of Rate Your Music or all of something, you know, like find one little thing and start there. But it looks like we're wrapping up here, I think.
Well, I got one thing.
Okay.
If you're using Python, there's a book called Automate the Boring Stuff. It has a chapter about scraping. It's just dedicated to scraping. You don't have to know that much about Python to use it. It was one of the first things I read, and I still reference it basically to this day. It's a great chapter. It's a free book. AutomateTheBoringStuff.com. It's free. If you're learning Python, I suggest you read every single thing in it. It's an amazing resource. But if you just want scraping, it has that one chapter, and that's good.
There's also, just jumping in because I'm back now. Automate the Boring Stuff has like an online course kind of along the same line as like, you know, any of the data websites courses. I can't remember what site it's on, but I used it, and like, well, I've used the kids version with small children at school. And it was really good kind of thing. So if you're someone who wants to learn Python, and wants to read this book but prefers more interactive activities and that immediate feedback, they occasionally do sales where you can do it for $0. So find out where it's from and keep an eye out for it. But thank you to all four of you for coming on and kind of giving everyone a little bit of look about actually what kind of goes on behind these websites, because I feel like we all go to them so often. And like, even, you know, I've done the whole website thing to a degree, and I'm still like about it all. So yes, thank you for that. Everyone else, some general housekeeping. We have about 30 minutes until trivia night. You can have maximum 4 people in your team. If you have more than 4 people in your team, do not tell me. I don't want to know about it. Pretend you only have 4. Blatantly lie. But like, please only have 4. There is a link in the description of this video, which will take you to the answer sheet. And yeah, in half an hour, I will be going live, pretending I'm a person who is funny while reading out the questions. So apologies for that in advance. I will see you all then. BYO your own drink.